I thought I was just running to the store to clear my head. I had no idea I was running for my life, or that a single wrong turn down a fog-covered street would unravel everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my family, and myself. My husband Daniel had been drinking since noon that day, which wasn't unusual anymore, but the way he'd grabbed my wrist when I tried to leave, the white-knuckled desperation in his grip, the smell of whiskey thick and rancid on his breath, that was new. That was something I'd never seen in his eyes before, and it terrified me in a way I couldn't name yet. And when the strange old man appeared at the corner of Maple and Fifth, his coat impossibly dry in the pouring rain, his eyes knowing mine before I'd ever spoken a word, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet in a way that had nothing to do with the wet pavement. My name is Clara Whitmore, though I'd been Clara Hargrove for 7 years, the kind of woman who believed in keeping her promises, even when the promises kept bleeding. I was 34 years old, a registered nurse with 12-hour shifts and a garden I tended every Sunday morning because the act of kneeling in cold earth felt more honest than anything else in my life. I had a house, not the one Daniel and I shared, but my grandmother's house, left to me when she passed 3 years ago. A craftsman bungalow on Birchwood Lane with a wraparound porch and oak floors that creaked in all the right places, the kind of house that held warmth the way old wood does, slowly and without fuss. I had rented it out to a quiet school teacher named Mrs. Albright, and the monthly rent money went straight into a savings account that Daniel didn't know existed, not because I was hiding anything, or so I told myself, but because my grandmother had been very clear in the last conversation we ever had that the house was mine alone. "Don't let anyone take what's yours, Clara Bird," she'd said, her papery hand wrapped around mine in the hospital bed. "Not even the people you love." I hadn't understood what she meant then. I was 28 and newly married and hopelessly in love with a man who made me feel like the most important person in every room he walked into. Daniel Hargrove was handsome in the easy, careless way of men who never had to try. Dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck, a smile that arrived slow and certain, like sunrise. He was a contractor, good with his hands, and in the early years he'd fix things around the house before I even noticed they were broken. He'd bring me coffee in bed on Saturday mornings, thick and sweet the way I liked it, and he'd read the newspaper out loud to me in that voice, low and unhurried, while I watched the light move across the ceiling. We were happy, or something that looked enough like happiness that I didn't question it. The drinking had started quietly, the way these things always do. A beer after work became 2, became a 6-pack, became something harder on weekends. He was never violent. I told myself this often, the way you repeat a prayer you're not entirely sure you believe. He'd never hit me. He'd never thrown anything at me. But there were other kinds of violence that didn't leave marks, and I was beginning to catalog them. The silences that stretched too long, the eyes that went flat and glassy, the way he'd say my name in a tone that made it sound like an accusation. Clara. Just that. As if my existence required a response. His mother, Brenda Hargrove, had been a fixture in our marriage from the beginning. She lived 40 minutes away in a cream-colored colonial she'd bought after Daniel's father left, and she drove over every Sunday without calling ahead, which Daniel insisted was just her way. She had silver hair she kept in a tight chignon and wore perfume that hit you from across the room, something floral and heavy, like gardenias left in a warm car. She was always bringing food, casseroles and glass dishes, pies and waxed paper, as if we were perpetually on the brink of starving. She'd set the containers on my kitchen counter, look around the room with that particular sweeping gaze of hers, assessing, measuring, and say something like, "Well, it's cozy in here, isn't it?" in a tone that made cozy sound like a polite word for small and insufficient. I'd always smiled and thanked her, because that's what I did. That's what Clara Hargrove, did. She smoothed things over and kept the peace, and told herself it was generosity, when really it was fear of what would happen if she stopped. There were things I noticed in the year before everything collapsed that I didn't want to notice. Small things, the kind you file away and refuse to look at directly, the way you don't stare at the sun. Brenda had started asking questions about my grandmother's house, not obvious questions, but careful ones, the kind slipped sideways into normal conversation. How much did property taxes run in that neighborhood? Had I thought about refinancing? She knew someone who worked in real estate, just in case I ever wanted to explore options. I told her I wasn't interested in selling, and she'd nodded and changed the subject, and I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong, of course. I just didn't know that yet. Daniel had been coming home later in the evenings. He said it was work. Projects running over, clients demanding changes at the last minute, the usual chaos of a contractor's life. But there was something different in the quality of his lateness. He used to come home tired and loose, the way physical work empties you pleasantly. Now he came home tense, wired, as if he'd been not working but planning. He'd pour himself a drink before he even took off his coat. He'd sit at the kitchen table and look at his phone with his jaw set tight, and when I'd ask him what was wrong, he'd say nothing in a way that meant everything, and I should stop asking. The Sunday 3 weeks before the night I ran, the Sunday I think of as the last quiet Sunday, had started ordinarily enough. I'd made biscuits from scratch, a recipe from my grandmother's handwritten card file, the index cards soft with handling and spotted with ancient butter. The kitchen smelled of warm dough and the rosemary I kept in a pot on the windowsill, and autumn light was coming through the curtains in long, golden strips. Daniel was still asleep. I poured my coffee and stood at the window and looked at the maple in the backyard, which had turned completely red overnight, the way they do, suddenly, all at once, as if they'd made a decision. I remember thinking it was beautiful. I remember being content, or something close to it, in the quiet before everything started. Brenda arrived at 10:30, earlier than usual, and there was something different about her manner that morning. She was bright-eyed, purposeful, moving with the kind of contained energy that made me think she'd been rehearsing. She set down a pan of cornbread, Daniel's favorite, and immediately asked if he was awake. Not, "How are you?" Not, "What a lovely morning." Just, was he awake? I told her he was sleeping in. She nodded, glanced toward the hallway, then sat down across from me at the kitchen table and folded her hands in front of her and said, "Clara, I want to talk to you about something, as family." And the word family landed in my stomach the way cold water does. A sudden contraction, a bracing. She said she'd been thinking about the future, about security, about how property values were going up and how it was a smart time to consolidate assets. She used that phrase, consolidate assets, as if she were a financial advisor and not a woman eating cornbread in my kitchen on a Sunday morning. She said Daniel had mentioned that I was sometimes stressed about managing the rental property on top of my nursing schedule, which surprised me because I had never said any such thing to Daniel or to anyone. She said she might know a buyer who could take the house off my hands for a good price. "Just think about it," she said, and smiled, and reached across the table and patted my hand with hers. Her hand was cool and dry, and her rings pressed against my fingers, and I had the sudden, absurd image of a trap closing. I told her the house wasn't for sale. She said of course, she was only offering. But as she stood to go wake Daniel, she simply stood and walked down the hallway to his bedroom door as if she lived here, as if permission were a courtesy she'd outgrown. I felt the first real thing I'd been refusing to feel for months. Not unease, not vague discomfort. Fear. The ordinary, cold-handed fear of someone who has understood suddenly that a plan is already in motion and they are behind. Daniel had started making phone calls in the backyard with the door closed. Once I came home early from a night shift and found him sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, and he closed it the moment he heard my key in the lock. Not quickly, not guiltily, just firmly, with a kind of practiced steadiness that was worse than guilt, because it meant he'd been expecting me to come home and had been ready. "Hey," he said, "thought you had a double." I told him someone covered the second half. He nodded and didn't ask any more questions. He just picked up his phone and went to the living room, and I stood in the kitchen in my scrubs and listened to him talk to someone in a low, careful voice. And I told myself I was tired. I was reading into things. That was all. I wasn't. Something was happening in my own home, carefully and deliberately, and I was the only one who didn't know the full shape of it yet. But I was about to find out. The night it finally broke was a Thursday in mid-October, unremarkable in every way except that it wasn't. The rain had started around 8, the kind of steady, windless rain that settles in like a house guest with no plans to leave. Daniel had come home at 6, carrying the particular kind of silence that I had come to recognize as dangerous. Not the easy quiet of a tired man, but a pressurized silence, like something contained behind glass. He went straight to the kitchen and poured 2 fingers of whiskey without speaking. I was in the living room folding laundry, and I watched him through the doorway and said nothing, because I had learned to read the thermometer of his moods the way you learn to navigate a house in the dark. By feel, by memory, by the location of things you know can hurt you. Brenda had called that afternoon. I'd seen her name on his phone when he'd left it on the counter while he went to the bathroom, and when he came back and picked it up, he looked at me with something in his eyes that might have been guilt, might have been warning, and said only, "My mother called," as if I hadn't seen, as if transparency were something we still practiced. I said, "I know," and he looked away, and we ate dinner in the kind of silence that has texture to it, that you can feel against your skin. By 9 o'clock, the whiskey was half gone. I was in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with my phone in my hands, trying to read an article I couldn't concentrate on, when he appeared in the doorway. He was still dressed, still in his work boots, which he almost never wore inside the house. He was meticulous about that, usually about keeping the outside out. And the fact that he hadn't changed struck me as significant in the way that small departures from routine always are when everything is already wrong. "We need to talk about the house," he said. I set my phone down. The words were so ordinary. We need to talk about the house. And yet something in the way he said them, the careful deliberateness of it, made my heart rate climb immediately. "Which house?" I said, though I knew. "Birchwood Lane." He crossed his arms, leaned against the doorframe. "My mother thinks it's a good time to sell. Property values in that area are up 20% from when your grandmother bought it. You could walk away with a significant profit." I looked at him for a long moment. "It's not for sale, Daniel." "Clara, I've told your mother. I'm telling you, it's not for sale. It was my grandmother's house. She left it to me." Something moved behind his eyes. "She left it to you to use. not to just sit on while some stranger pays you rent every month. If you sold it, we could pay off the mortgage here. We? I said. And again, like before, that one word, the pronoun, the implication, hit something in him. Don't do that, he said. His voice had gone flat. I'm not doing anything. I'm asking you to explain why my property is suddenly a financial plan for us. He pushed off the door frame and came 2 steps into the room. My mother has been talking to a developer. There's a serious offer, real money. She's been doing this for us, Clara, because I asked her to look into it, because you never listen when I try to... You asked her? I stood up. You asked her to go find a buyer for my house without telling me, without asking me. I told you, you never... Daniel. My voice was quiet. Quieter than I expected it to be. Did you sign anything? The pause that followed was 3 seconds long. 3 seconds is not a long time in most circumstances. In this one, it was an eternity. And in that eternity, I saw everything I needed to see in his face. The flicker, the recalibration, the choice between honesty and management. And I knew with a cold, absolute certainty that something had already happened that I didn't know about yet. No, he said, nothing is signed. He was lying. I didn't know how I knew so completely and immediately, but I did. The way you know a smell before you can name it. He poured another drink after that and told me I was overreacting. He told me I was emotionally exhausted from work and that I needed to hear him out when he was trying to help. He said the word help the way certain people say it, as a shield, as a preemptive accusation, so that any refusal of help becomes a character flaw in the one refusing. I had heard him use that construction before. I had let it work before, not tonight. Tonight something had clamped shut inside me, a cold and final closing, and when he reached out and wrapped his hand around my wrist, gentler this time, or so he thought, but hard enough that I felt the pressure of each individual finger, I pulled away so sharply that he blinked. "Don't," I said. He stared at me. Then he sat down and looked at his glass and said nothing. I went to the back door, I took my jacket and my keys, and I went out into the rain without another word, and I started walking. And then I started running, because the running felt like the only honest thing my body knew how to do. The rain was cold and thorough. Within a block, my hair was flat against my head, and my jacket was dark with wet, and I didn't care. I turned corners without thinking, block after block, moving through the orange-lit emptiness of the streets, the trees heavy with October water, the gutters running fast. My wrist throbbed where his hand had been. I kept seeing his face, that pause, those 3 seconds, and feeling the knowledge settle into me like sediment, cloudy at first and then with time, clarifying. Something was signed. I didn't know what, but something was signed, and I needed to find out before it was too late. I had turned onto 5th Street without knowing it when I saw the old man. He was standing at the corner of Maple and 5th, beneath a street lamp that made a small circle of orange light around him. His coat was long and dark, and the rain fell around him, but not, as far as I could tell, on him. This was the thing I noticed first, irrationally, absurdly, before I noticed his face or his posture, or the absolute stillness of him. He was dry. In the middle of a downpour, he was dry, as if the weather had agreed to make an exception. He was very old, the kind of old that seems less like age than like duration, as if he had simply been present for an unusually long portion of history. His eyes, when they found mine, were the color of winter sky, pale gray, very clear. And they found mine easily, the way you look at someone you already know. "Clara," he said. I stopped walking. The rain hissed around us. A car passed somewhere on a parallel street, its headlights sweeping briefly through the fog. My heart was slamming against my ribs in a way that had nothing to do with the running. "How do you know my name?" I said. He gestured to a bench nearby. An iron park bench I was almost certain had not been there the last time I'd walked this block, and said, "Come sit down. You look like someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. I should have kept walking. A sensible woman would have kept walking. But I was not feeling particularly sensible, and there was something in his voice, a quality of certainty, of unhurried authority, that made the bench feel less like a stranger's suggestion and more like an instruction from a part of myself I'd been ignoring. I sat down. The bench was dry, too, I noticed. All of this was impossible, and I was too exhausted to argue with it. He sat beside me. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the rain-slicked street, and then he said, "The document was signed 3 days ago, a limited power of attorney, notarized at an office on Clement Street. It authorizes your mother-in-law to negotiate on your behalf in property transactions. Your husband forged your signature." The world went very quiet around me, not silent. The rain was still there, the distant traffic, the hum of the street lamp above, but the sound seemed to come from a great distance, muffled, as if someone had pressed cotton against my ears. I was aware of my own breathing, in, out, the cold of the iron bench through my wet jeans. "That's not possible," I said, and even as I said it, I knew it was not only possible, but true. I could feel the truth of it the way you feel a shift in barometric pressure, in your sinuses, at the back of your eyes. "I know it isn't what you wanted to hear," the old man said. He was not unkind about it. He spoke the way someone speaks when they are delivering a hard thing because you need to know it, not because they enjoy the delivery. "Who are you?" I asked. He looked at me. "My name is Walter. I knew your grandmother. We were neighbors on Birchwood Lane for 11 years, before I moved away. She talked about you often." He paused. "She worried about you. Specifically, she worried about whether you'd be strong enough, when the time came, to protect what she'd left you." Another pause, longer this time. "I think she knew something like this might happen. She was a perceptive woman." My grandmother. I thought of her hands, her papery voice, the particular smell of her kitchen, cinnamon and old books, and something that might have been lavender. "Don't let anyone take what's yours, Clara Bird." The words landed now with a weight they hadn't carried when she'd said them. She had not been speaking in metaphor. She had not been offering general wisdom. She had been issuing a specific warning. "The office on Clement Street," I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by how steady it was. "Forged signatures on notarized documents. Is there a way to challenge it?" "Yes." Walter reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a business card, which he held out to me between 2 fingers. The card was cream-colored, heavy stock, with a name printed in simple black type, Margaret Chen, attorney at law. She's a real estate attorney. She has handled exactly this kind of case before. Call her in the morning. He paused. "And Clara, before you call her, go home. Find the documents. There will be more than the power of attorney. There is a draft purchase agreement in the upper left drawer of your husband's desk in the study in a manila folder. Look at it carefully, especially the date on the signature line. I stared at him. "How do you know all of this?" He smiled, the same slow smile as before, starting in the eyes. "Because I was there," he said simply, and did not elaborate. "Go home. Be calm. He will be asleep. You have time." I looked down at the business card in my hand. Margaret Chen. The cardstock was cool against my fingers, the ink slightly raised. When I looked up to ask another question, there were 100 of them, crowding against each other. The bench beside me was empty. The space where he had been sitting was dry. The rain fell. The street lamp buzzed. There was no one at the corner of Maple and Fifth in either direction, nothing but wet pavement and orange light and the steady sound of rain on everything. I sat alone on that bench for 2 full minutes, breathing. Then I stood up, put the business card in my jacket pocket, and walked home. The house was quiet when I got back. The kitchen light was still on, casting a low yellow glow through the window into the wet backyard, but the rest of the rooms were dark. I stood at the back door for a moment with my key in my hand and my wet jacket dripping onto the steps, listening. Nothing. Just the refrigerator's hum and the last of the rain tapping softly against the gutters. I went inside. Daniel was asleep on the couch, one arm thrown over his eyes, the whiskey glass empty on the coffee table beside him. He slept the way heavy drinkers do, deeply, unreachably, a kind of absence that was almost complete. I stood in the doorway and looked at him for a long moment. 7 years. I had loved this man for 7 years, and he was lying there with his work boots still on, and somewhere in his desk there was a document with my name on it in handwriting that wasn't mine. I went to the study. The room smelled of sawdust and old coffee, which was how it always smelled. He'd bring mugs in there and forget them, rings of dried coffee on the edges of receipts and invoices. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I used my phone's flashlight, keeping it low, moving it across the desk. The upper left drawer. Walter had said upper left drawer, and I hadn't questioned how he knew, and I didn't question it now. I pulled the drawer open. There were pens, a stapler, a folded receipt, a small notepad, and underneath the notepad, exactly where he'd said it would be, a manila folder. My hands were steady. I don't know why they were steady. The rest of me, my chest, my stomach, the space behind my eyes, was anything but. But my hands opened the folder with a kind of mechanical calm, and I angled my phone's light onto the first page, and I read. It was a purchase agreement. The address at the top was Birchwood Lane. The buyer was listed as Hargrove Property Holdings, LLC, a company name I had never heard and which, I would later learn, had been incorporated by Brenda 2 months earlier. The sale price was listed at $60,000 below current market value, and at the bottom of the second page, on the seller's signature line, was my name, Clara Hargrove, written in ink, in a hand that was close enough to mine that it might fool a busy notary, but that I knew, looking at it, was not mine. The capital C too upright, the loop of the R too narrow, my name in someone else's hand, selling my grandmother's house. I sat down on the floor of the study. I didn't plan to sit down. My legs simply stopped holding me up, and the floor rose to meet me, and I sat there in the dark with the folder in my lap and my phone light illuminating the signature line, and I felt something in my chest that was not yet anger and not yet grief, but something between them, something that had no name, a feeling like standing at the edge of a very large drop and understanding, for the first time, its depth. There was a third page. I almost missed it, tucked behind the purchase agreement. It was a letter. Handwritten on Brenda's personal stationery, the cream paper with the small floral border I had seen 100 times on birthday cards and holiday notes. It was addressed to the buyer's representative, and it outlined a timeline. The power of attorney had been executed 3 days ago. The purchase agreement was to be formally submitted to the title company the following Monday. The property would transfer within 30 days. At the bottom, in a postscript that made my vision blur at the edges, Brenda had written, "Daniel has handled his end. She won't know until it's done. She won't know until it's done." I read those 6 words 4 times. Each time they meant the same thing, and each time the meaning was worse. Daniel had not been dragged into this. Daniel had not been weak or confused or caught between his wife and his mother. Daniel had handled his end. Daniel was not a bystander. Daniel was a participant and had been one from the beginning, and every evasion and every deflection and every "you're overreacting" for the past 2 months had been not weakness, but strategy. I put the folder in my jacket pocket. Then I took photographs of every page with my phone, sent them to my personal email, and then sent them again to a secondary address I hadn't used in 2 years. Then I sat on the study floor for 3 more minutes, in the dark, listening to my husband breathe in the next room, and I let myself feel everything, the full weight of it, the betrayal and the grief and the sickening retroactive re-examination of every conversation, every reassurance, every "I love you" spoken in this house, because I knew that after tonight I would not have the luxury of feeling it. After tonight I would need to be someone other than a woman sitting on the floor in wet clothes with her heart in pieces. I would need to be someone with a plan. At 7:15 the next morning, I called Margaret Chen. She answered on the second ring. I told her my name. I told her Walter had sent me. There was a brief pause on her end, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. And then she said, "Tell me everything." And I did. I spoke for 11 minutes without stopping. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for 4 seconds, and then she said, "Can you be in my office by 9?" I said yes. She said, "Bring the photographs and the original folder. Don't put the folder back. Don't speak to your husband or your mother-in-law before we meet. Don't let on that you know anything." I said I understood. She said, "Good. Clara, you caught this in time. Barely, but in time." I hung up and stood in the bathroom with the door locked and the shower running so that Daniel, who had woken and was moving around the kitchen, couldn't hear me. And I pressed both palms flat against the cold tile wall, and I breathed. And I thought of my grandmother's hands, and I thought, this is where it changes. Margaret Chen's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, her walls lined with law books and a single-framed photograph of the Golden Gate Bridge. She was a small woman in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the brisk, unhurried manner of someone who has seen everything twice. She went through the photographs on my phone with the focused silence of a surgeon examining an X-ray, and when she reached Brenda's handwritten letter, she made a short, exhaled sound, not quite a word, and set the phone down. "The power of attorney is fraudulent," she said. "Forged signature and the notarization can be challenged because there's no record of you appearing in person at that office, which is required. The purchase agreement is also invalid for the same reason. The LLC was incorporated specifically for this transaction, which raises additional flags." She folded her hands on the desk. "This is not a sophisticated fraud, Clara. It's brazen. They were counting on you not finding out until the title had already transferred." She paused. "I'm filing an emergency injunction today to freeze the sale and flag the title." I'll also be contacting the notary's licensing board and will be reporting the forgery to the DA's office." "The DA's office," I repeated. "Forgery is a felony," Margaret said simply. "Both of them are exposed, your husband and your mother-in-law." She looked at me steadily. "I want you to be prepared for what comes next. This will not be quiet." It was not quiet. I drove home after the meeting and walked into the kitchen where Daniel was sitting with his coffee, and I set the manila folder on the table in front of him without saying a word, and I watched his face. I watched it the way you watch something collapse, not with satisfaction, not with pleasure, but with the terrible clarity of someone who needs to see the truth confirmed with their own eyes. His face went white, then red, then a peculiar, awful blankness, as if all the expressions had canceled each other out. "Clara," he said. "She won't know until it's done," I said quietly. "That's what she wrote. That's what you two decided." I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "I want to hear you say it, not an explanation, not an excuse. I want to hear you say what you did." He looked at the table. His hands were around his coffee mug and I could see his knuckles. "I thought," he started. "No," I said. "Say what you did." A long silence. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. Finally, without looking up, he said, "We were going to split the money, pay off the mortgage, give my mother the rest." His voice was very low. "She has debt, Clara. She needed, I said. "And so you forged my name." I stood up. There was no heat in me now. That was the strangest part. I had expected rage, hot and consuming, but what I had instead was something colder and cleaner, like water under ice, like a blade that has been properly sharpened. "Margaret Chen filed an injunction this morning. The sale is frozen. The DA's office has the forgery report." I picked up my keys. "I'm staying at my friend Denise's tonight. My lawyer will be in touch with yours." He was staring at me now, something close to panic finally breaking through the blankness. Clara, please, we can... If you would just let me explain..." "You had 7 years to explain things to me," I said. "You chose 3 seconds of silence when I asked if you'd signed anything." I walked to the door. I hope whatever your mother needed was worth it. The confrontation with Brenda came 2 days later. She arrived at the house, clearly not knowing I was there, expecting to find Daniel alone, and when she walked into the kitchen and saw me sitting at the table with Margaret Chen beside me, she stopped in the doorway with her casserole dish still in her hands and went the color of old chalk. "Brenda," I said, "put the food down. We need to talk." She recovered quickly. She set the dish on the counter with practiced composure and turned to face me, and her chin came up, and she said, "Clara, whatever Daniel has told you, I want you to understand that everything I did was for this family." "You forged my signature," I said, "on a notarized legal document, to sell a property that was left to me. I was trying to help. You two have been struggling, and the money..." "Stop." The word came out the way she'd always meant hers to land, with finality, with authority, with the particular weight of a door being closed permanently. "I've heard the explanation. I don't need the performance." I leaned forward slightly. "The injunction has been filed. The title company has been notified. The DA has the forgery report, and the notary is being investigated for negligence. The LLC you incorporated is being examined. The developer has been contacted by my attorney." I paused and let the silence breathe. "It's over, Brenda. All of it. And I want you to understand something very clearly. This house, my grandmother's house on Birchwood Lane, is mine. It will always have been mine, and you will not have it." Her mouth opened, closed. For the first time in 7 years, Brenda Hargrove had nothing to say. Margaret and I left her standing in the kitchen with her casserole going cold on the counter. The months that followed were hard in the way that necessary things often are. Daniel and I separated formally in November. He did not contest it. The forgery charges hanging over his head made any legal aggression inadvisable, a fact Margaret had mentioned to his attorney with the measured calm of someone reading a weather report. Brenda was charged with forgery and criminal fraud. The charges were reduced in a plea agreement, but she was placed on probation and ordered to pay restitution. The developer quietly withdrew. Mrs. Albright stayed in the Birchwood Lane house, and her rent check arrived in my account every first of the month, steady and reliable as a heartbeat. I went back to Birchwood Lane on a Saturday in February, the first genuinely warm day of the year, when the light had that early spring quality, thin and bright and full of tentative promise. I walked up the porch steps and sat in the old rocking chair beside the front door and looked out at the street, at the bare maples beginning to bud, at a neighbor walking a large and happy dog, at the ordinary, unhurried beauty of a Saturday morning. The porch boards were cold through my jeans. The rocking chair creaked the way it always had. The street smelled of thawing earth and wood smoke from a chimney somewhere, and it smelled, faintly and unmistakably, of something that might have been cinnamon, which was impossible, and which I chose not to question. I thought about Walter. I had gone back to the corner of Maple and Fifth 3 times looking for the bench. It wasn't there. I had found no listing for the notary office on Clement Street that had supposedly processed the power of attorney. It didn't exist. And yet Margaret Chen existed, and her injunction was real, and my house was still mine. Some things resist explanation. My grandmother would not have found this surprising. She had always been practical about the inexplicable. It exists, she used to say, whether you understand it or not. I sat in her rocking chair and I thought, I'm still here. The house is still here. They had tried to take it, carefully and deliberately and without my knowledge, and they had failed, and I was sitting on the porch in the February sun with the whole of my life in front of me. Altered, yes, stripped of certain illusions. Yes, but intact and mine. I had lost something, of course. I had lost a marriage, and a version of the man I'd married, and the particular kind of trust that, once broken in that specific way, does not reassemble itself into the same shape. That kind of loss doesn't resolve. It integrates, becomes part of the architecture of who you become. I knew that. I was not pretending otherwise, and I was not trying to rush past it, but I was sitting on my grandmother's porch in the February sun, and the rocking chair creaked, and the maples were budding, and I was, for the first time in longer than I could honestly remember, not afraid. My grandmother used to say that the things people try hardest to take from you are always the things most worth keeping. I understand now that she wasn't only talking about the house. She was talking about the self that lives inside it, the one that knows its own name and its own worth, and when to stop running and turn around and fight. I stopped running. I turned around. I know the rest.